guys, so today we're going to be talking about urbanization during the industrialization period. And very basically, urbanization is the rapid growth of cities. And during industrialization, we start to see the population of the United States shift from rural, so farmland, to urban cities. We start to see this shift from rural to urban areas. And by the end of the Industrial Revolution, we're actually going to have the majority of Americans living in cities. And why does this happen? Why does urbanization happen? Well, because the businesses and factories that are fueling the Industrial Revolution are located in the cities. And if the businesses and factories are located in the cities, that's where the jobs are going to be. So the people are going to want to be where the jobs are. And we're going to have people from all over the country and even all over the world drawn by these wide availability of jobs and these economic opportunities. And although it's going to be kind of hard to believe by the end of this, when we talk about the problems and issues that we see in cities during urbanization, we're actually going to see an increase in the standard of living. There's an improvement in the standard of living from people's previous circumstances. So let's go ahead and look at a chart really quickly to show us exactly how much cities grew during this time. So this chart's going to show us the population growth of 4 major U.S. cities from 1860 to 1900. The blue data is going to represent the population in 4 cities in 1860, so just prior to the Civil War and just prior to industrialization. And then the red is going to show us the population in those same cities in 1900, so during industrialization. So let's look really quickly. So we can see New York in 1860 was the biggest city in the United States, but not even New York has a population of 1 million people. And let's look, just 40 years later, you guys can see, look how much the populations in each of these cities have grown. Not only do we have New York over 1 million people, 3.5 million people in that city alone, we have 3 major cities in the United States with a population of over 1 million people. So these cities are going to become very large during the industrialization period. So let's talk about the people who are moving here. Who's coming to these cities? We start to see a large influx of immigrants and migrants that causes this boom in cities. The massive amounts of people coming in meant that these cities were very, very dense. So a lot of people living in smaller areas. And there was a huge need for unskilled labor. The factories really needed unskilled workers. And a reminder, unskilled workers means jobs that don't require any training. So we have immigrants looking for economic opportunities. And in the factories, we have jobs that we need filled. So people come to the cities looking for job opportunities. And as a reminder, many of these immigrants are fleeing famine, revolutions, religious persecution, and poor economies in their home countries. So they come to the city looking for jobs. So let's talk about the effects of urbanization. Now that we have immigrants coming to the cities looking for jobs, and we know that these cities are very densely populated, there's a lot of people living in small areas. It causes city services, things like housing, water, sanitation, transportation, to really be stretched to the limit. And a lot of problems are going to arise. A lot of problems are going to come about because of this. Let's talk about some of those problems that we start to see in urban cities during industrialization. So one of those problems is going to be, well, where do all these people live? Where do these millions of people coming into these cities, where do we put them? And these people are going to start living in something called tenement buildings, tenement housing. So tenements are, think back to the pictures you guys just looked at. They're very unsafe apartment buildings with tiny rooms, no ventilation, very poor sanitation. And housing becomes really a major issue of America's cities during this time period. So to accommodate these growing populations, tenement buildings were designed. They're very narrow, as you guys can see in these pictures. So here's one tenement building, and look how close. Here's another. And here's like an aerial plan of what they look like from above. They're built in rows, 6 or 8 stories up. Very, very close together. They were called dumbbell tenements. If you guys look at this image right here, because we can see that this tiny little courtyard between the two buildings makes it resemble a dumbbell because they're very long and narrow. These buildings were very, very crowded, designed for up to a few hundred families we would have, or a few hundred people. We would have thousands of families packed in tenement buildings. Very few rooms in them had windows, very poorly ventilated. The buildings were overcrowded, noisy, dirty, and not a good place for people to be living, especially children. If you guys can see these little kids right up top on the roof of this tenement building. And the conditions there were very unsanitary and very dangerous because you have so many people living in these buildings with no ventilation and no sanitation. Outbreaks of infectious diseases were very common here. Things like tuberculosis would spread very quickly and very frequently. So another issue, and here's some images of tenement buildings. So here's a family in their tenement apartment. Okay, so an entire family living in a very, very small space. They were very narrow rooms, as you guys can see in this one. Here's the courtyard of a tenement building. You guys can see not a lot of space for people, very overcrowded, very dangerous looking. Another issue that we're going to see as a result of urbanization is cultural conflict. So there starts to become a lot of racism and discrimination toward immigrants during this time period. They're seen as different. They're seen as a threat. So they would live in things called cultural enclaves. So basically, and ethnic enclaves. Basically, people from similar backgrounds who spoke the same language, ate the same food. They would live together in these ethnic enclaves and they would provide each other with assistance and provide each other with protection. If they could live together with people who were similar to them, it would protect them from the potential violence they might face due to racism and discrimination. So another issue that we're going to see because of urbanization in these urban cities is poor sanitation. There was no garbage collection, no trash removal. So waste and trash were just tossed in the street, open sewage. This is also going to contribute to sickness and disease in urban cities during industrialization. Crime was another problem faced by people living in these urban tenements and these neighborhoods. Because these places house mostly immigrants and the poor, they're largely unsupervised by police during this time period. And this lack of policing left these residents very vulnerable to crime, and theft was very, very common. Fires were another problem. As you guys, when we looked at these pictures, I'm sure you guys thought, right? Like these pictures and right here, I'm sure you guys were thinking to yourselves, that looks like a disaster waiting to happen. So fire was a constant hazard in these tenement buildings and factories, and even buildings with fire escapes were fire traps. One of the worst, if you guys look at this newspaper heading right here, one of the worst examples of this was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York. This tragedy where we can see up here where the factory was located on the top floors. This tragedy where over 100 workers were killed in this fire brought a lot of attention to the dangerous conditions of the factories and lack of safety in the urban buildings and tenements in cities during industrialization. So some people are going to come about during this time period, and they're going to expose the life in the cities that these immigrants are living. And one of which is Jacob Riis. You guys looked at his pictures during your warm-up. And Jacob Riis was a muckraker. A muckraker was a journalist or reporter who went about exposing the problems of industrialization. And they wanted to expose the problems of industrialization to try to inspire change. He wrote a book and he took pictures And the book was titled How the Other Half Lives. And he was very critical of an industrial society and questioned the effects of industrialization and urbanization. He wanted to show people the extreme poverty, the disease, the crime in immigrant neighborhoods. And so, what we're going to be talking about in the next unit when we talk about progressives, not only are we going to be talking about Jacob Riis and him exposing the issues of urban areas during industrialization, we're also going to be talking about other muckrakers and the problems that they're going to draw attention to during industrialization.